The sun rose over the ancient plains of Mesopotamia, casting a molten glow across the sprawling city of Uruk. Towering ziggurats pierced the sky, their shadows stretching like dark fingers across the bustling streets. Merchants shouted over clamor carts. Priests chanted in the echoing courtyards, and the scent of burning incense mingled with the tang of river mud from the Euphrates. This was the cradle of civilization, rich, powerful, and restless. From among its people, one man rose higher than any other. His name was Nimrod, known in later tongues as Namrood, a king whose ambition would drive and defy not only men, but the very God of the heavens. Ancient inscriptions and traditions remember him as the great-grandson of Noah, the son of Cush, a descendant of Ham. He was a mighty hunter, not merely a beast, but men's loyalties, their fears, and their obedience. His skill in war, his command of armies, and his ruthless consolidation of power turned scattered settlements into the first true empire the world had known. The lands he ruled were not small kingdoms bound by fragile treaties. They were cities welded together by force. Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh rose under his banner in the land of Shinar. His rule extended northward to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and the great city of Rezin. In a time when humanity had only recently emerged from the shadow of the flood, still united by one language, Nimrod used that unity as a weapon. He turned cooperation into control, and control into absolute dominion. But Mesopotamia in Nimrod's day was more than bricks and armies. It was the center of human culture, writing, agriculture, and trade. The temples to many gods, Anu, Enlil, Ishtar, stood as the spiritual heart of his realm. The priesthoods wielded influence, and religion was intertwined with politics. Nimrod understood this better than anyone. He did not simply rule through law and force. He ruled through belief. To question him was to question the divine order he claimed to embody. And yet, there was another belief, an older truth carried from the survivors of the flood, the worship of the one Creator. Nimrod's reign marked the beginning of a deep rebellion against that truth. In his cities, idols multiplied. The people were taught to bow before stone and gold, to worship the creation instead of the Creator. His court became a place where power and blasphemy walked hand in hand. The people prospered in ways they had never known before. Trade routes stretched to far lands. Harvests filled the granaries. Artisans crafted wonders in clay and bronze. Yet beneath the prosperity, Nimrod's ambition was moving towards something greater, something dangerous. He envisioned a kingdom unshaken by flood, famine, or divine judgment. He would build not only an empire, but a monument to human supremacy itself. It began with the plain of Shinar, a flat expanse perfect for an undertaking unlike any before. Nimrod called his leaders, his engineers, his laborers, and laid out his vision, a city crowned with a tower that would reach the heavens. It would be built not of stone, which was scarce, but of baked brick and mortar bitumen. Every hand was set to the task. Kilns burned day and night, sending pillars of smoke into the sky. The sound of hammers and chisels rang across the plain. The tower's purpose was more than practical. It was a statement. In the hearts of its builders, it was a fortress against the will of God. It would defy any command to spread across the earth. It would be the seat of human unity, the unshakable center of all nations, ruled by the will of one man. And at its pinnacle, Nimrod would stand, not as a servant of heaven, but as a challenger to it. Word of this great work spread. Tribes from distant lands came to see it, and many stayed to join the effort, swelling the city's population. The tower rose higher and higher, visible for miles, a pillar of ambition cutting into clouds. In the streets, songs were sung of Nimrod's glory. In the temples, prayers to many gods were whispered for the tower's success. But the oldest of the faithful, those who remembered the covenant of Noah, saw in its shadow the beginning of ruin. The political order of Nimrod's empire grew tighter as the tower rose. He established systems of tribute, demanding wealth, labor, and military service from every city. Governors loyal to him enforced his decrees. Soldiers patrolled the roads, ensuring the flow of resources to the capital. No man could rise without Nimrod's favor. No voice could speak against him without swift and brutal consequence. Yet Nimrod was not without personal gifts. His charisma was undeniable. In the public square, he could move crowds to cheers or to silence with a single gesture. He presented himself as the father of a nation, the guardian of civilization, the bringer of peace through strength. His hunts were legendary. Whether tracking lions in the grasslands or leading armies against rebellious tribes, he returned victorious. Each triumph fed the legend of the king, who could not be challenged. But within his palace walls, ambition hardened into pride. His counselors spoke only what he wished to hear. The voices of caution were silenced or exiled. The priests of the Creator found their gatherings watched, their words twisted into accusations of sedition. Nimrod's vision for the tower was no longer just a symbol. It had become an obsession. Its completion, he believed, would secure his name forever, placing him beyond the reach of time, judgment, or divine will. As the tower neared its uppermost stages, tensions deepened. Whispers spread of a man who had appeared in the city, a man who did not bow to Nimrod or his gods. He spoke of the one true Creator, the God of Noah, the maker of heaven and earth. His words were quiet, but they carried a weight that unsettled those who heard them. Some called him a prophet, others a madman, but all agreed he was dangerous to the order Nimrod had built. Nimrod's spies reported to him about this stranger, whose defiance seemed to mirror the king's own, but directed toward a higher power. The king's eyes narrowed. In a realm where no man could stand against his will, this figure's very existence was a challenge. And challenges Nimrod did not tolerate. Far above, the wind howled around the unfinished crown of the tower. From its heights, the king could see the vastness of his dominion. The rivers glinting like silver threads, the cities humming with life, the horizon lost in haze. It seemed the world lay in his hand. Yet somewhere below, a voice was rising, one that would set in motion events neither Nimrod nor his tower could withstand. And then, one day, the work on the tower would face something no man's ambition could foresee. The morning began like any other in the plain of Shinar, kills roaring, laborers sweating beneath the rising sun, foremen shouting orders in the single language that bound them all. But high above, unseen by mortal eyes, judgment was approaching. The tower had become the heartbeat of Nimrod's empire, every brick a declaration of defiance, every tier a step toward his imagined immortality. The man whose presence had unsettled the city continued to speak in quiet gatherings. His name was Abram, a descendant of Shem, born generations after flood. He had grown up surrounded by the idols of his people, yet his heart turned toward the unseen Creator. His words were not a rebellion against Nimrod's authority in worldly matters, but futility of defying the will of heaven. Still, in Nimrod's court, such words were poison. The message spread in whispers that the Creator of heaven and earth was not confined to ziggurats or images of gold, that his power could not be challenged by bricks and mortar. Those who listened began to question. If the tower was a shield against divine judgment, why would the one true God be moved by human walls? If Nimrod's rule was ordained by heaven, why did this man speak of a kingdom greater still? Reports of unrest reached the palace. Nimrod summoned his closest advisors. The tower was nearly complete, its uppermost stages stretching toward the sky, but murmurs among the workers threatened to slow its progress. The king's brow furrowed. He could crush rebellion with armies, silence dissent with executions. But this was something more insidious. An idea had taken root. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, Nimrod summoned Abram. The great hall was lit by oil lamps, their flames trembling in the still air. Guards lined the walls, their spears catching the light. At the far end, the king sat upon his throne, the carved lions at his base glaring as fiercely as their living counterparts. Abram was brought forward. Nimrod's gaze was steady, his voice measured. "You speak of a God above the heavens," he said. "You say he commands men to scatter, to fill the earth, and yet here I have gathered them, united them, made them strong. Tell me, what God could oppose such greatness?" Abram's answer was calm, but his eyes were unwavering. "The one who made the heavens you seek to touch, the one who gave the earth you claim to rule. His will cannot be overturned by mortar, nor his judgment avoided by height." The hall fell silent. Nimrod's fingers tightened on the armrest of his throne. No man had ever spoken to him so plainly. Yet in that moment, something in the king's expression changed. Anger, yes, but also a flicker of something more dangerous. resolve. That night, the council met in secret. Some urged the king to have Abram killed before his influence grew. Others, more cautious, warned of omens and the wrath of the god Abram served. But Nimrod was not a man to bow to warnings. The tower would rise. The people would remain united under his command. And any who threatened that unity, be it prophet or god, would be dealt with. In the days that followed, the work resumed with greater urgency. Orders were given to keep watch over gatherings, to root out those who questioned the king's vision. The streets grew tense. Conversations hushed when soldiers passed. Yet even as Nimrod tightened his grip, something began to change among the workers. It began subtly. Teams of laborers failed to understand instructions. Cart drivers argued over routes. Foremen shouted orders that were met with confusion. The common tongue that had bound them all began to fracture. Words twisted into unfamiliar sounds. Gestures replaced speech. Misunderstandings sparked quarrels. Quarrels turned to fights, and soon the work ground to a halt. Nimrod descended from his palace in fury, demanding answers. What he found was chaos. Bricklayers unable to coordinate, traders unable to bargain, guards unable to relay commands. The unity that had been his greatest weapon had dissolved overnight into 100 incomprehensible tongues. The tower, still unfinished, stood as a jagged wound in the sky. The people began to drift away in groups, some to the mountains, some to the rivers, some to distant lands, each taking their new language with them. Nimrod shouted commands, but they fell like stones into the sea. The vision of a single empire, one people under one rule, had shattered. For the first time, the king stood powerless. The scattering of the people was irreversible, and the tower, once the symbol of his invincibility, became a monument to his failure. Some said the confusion was a direct act of the Creator himself, a judgment for defiance. Others whispered that Abram's God had offended his name against the pride of men. But in Nimrod's heart, humiliation burned hotter than any kiln. He withdrew from the plains of Shinar, turning his gaze northward. If he could not unite the world through one city and one language, he would forge power through conquest. In Assyria, he built the strongholds of Nineveh and Kala, fortresses that would endure for centuries. His armies swept across the Fertile Crescent, crushing opposition, seizing tribute. The dream of the tower was dead, but the empire of Nimrod was far from finished. In those years, his legend grew darker. He became known not only as a builder and hunter, but as a tyrant. Cities fell under his shadow, their temples filled with idols to gods who demanded offerings of blood and grain. Yet the memory of the scattering haunted him. He could command armies, but he could not command heaven. Some accounts speak of a reckoning between Nimrod and Abram that went beyond words, of fire prepared for prophet, and of deliverance that defied the king's power. Whatever the details, one truth remained. Their paths had crossed, and Nimrod's reign, though mighty, could not silence the message Abram carried. Years passed. Nimrod's hair silvered, but his ambition did not fade. He sought new means to secure his legacy, turning ever more to the priesthoods and their rights, binding his rule to the favor of the gods he had exalted. But the lands he ruled were changing. New powers stirred beyond his borders. Old alliances frayed. The unity he once commanded could not be restored. And then came word from the west of a growing people who traced their faith to Abram, who claimed the blessing of the Creator himself. Nimrod's eyes narrowed as he heard it. Though years had passed since the tower, the challenge he had once faced was rising again, this time in the form of a covenant that promised the world to a people not his own. The king who had once defied the heavens would not let such a threat go unanswered. The summons went out across Nimrod's dominion. Messengers on swift horses rode through city gates, into marketplaces, along the rivers, bearing the king's seal. The command was clear. The leaders of every province, the generals of every army, the priests of every temple were to gather in the capital. The tone of the decree left no doubt. This was not counsel being sought, but orders being given. When they arrived, they found the king seated in the great hall, flanked by banners from the far reaches of his empire. His eyes were sharp, his voice steady, but there was an urgency in his bearing. He spoke of the threat from the west, a people bound not by stone walls or swords, but by a covenant with a God who claimed dominion over all nations. It was not an army that troubled him, but the idea they carried, the same idea that had once unsettled his city when Abram had stood before him. "We have seen," Nimrod said, "how such words can weaken resolve, divide loyalties, and undo what kings have built. If these people are allowed to grow, they will not need armies to challenge us. They will claim that their God has already conquered the earth." He ordered scouts and emissaries to watch the movements of Abram's descendants, to assess their numbers, their alliances, their resources. At the same time, he strengthened his military campaigns, ensuring that his borders were secured and his presence felt. Cities were fortified, tribute increased, and temples to the gods of the empire were expanded to assert the divine favor of Nimrod's rule. But within the palace, the old restlessness gnawed at him. Victory in battle did not erase the memory of the tower's ruin. The scattering of the nations remained a wound to his pride. The more he heard of Abram's God, the God who had confounded the tongues and broken his vision, the deeper his determination grew to stand against him. In the high courts of the priests, sacrifices were made in Nimrod's name, invoking the strength of the gods of Mesopotamia. Processions wound through the streets of Nineveh and Kala, laden with offerings. The king appeared among them, a living symbol of power, the chosen of the gods of earth and sky. Yet in the back of his mind, he knew there was one whose favor he did not possess. It was during one such festival that news reached him from the frontiers. Abram's household had grown into a tribe of considerable wealth and influence. Herds covered the hillsides where they camped. Servants and warriors stood ready at his command. More troubling still, they spoke openly of the Creator's promises that Abram's descendants would inherit lands and blessings beyond number. These were not idle boasts. The people spoke with certainty that echoed through the land. Nimrod's advisors urged him to act swiftly. Some proposed sending envoys to demand allegiance. Others suggested seizing the tribe by force before it could multiply. But the king was no longer dealing with a city of builders whose speech could be confused. This was a people scattered across the hills and valleys, bound together not by walls but by faith. Striking them openly might make them martyrs, and martyrs could inspire rebellion. So Nimrod turned to a different strategy. He would undermine them not with armies, but with influence. Traders loyal to him were sent into their territory, carrying goods, stories, and rumors. Alliances were offered to neighboring tribes on the condition that they pressure Abram's household. Slowly, the king sought to weave a net around them, to choke their growth without drawing his sword. But the reports that returned were troubling. Wherever Abram went, he prospered. Conflicts that might have destroyed another tribe ended in his favor. Even kings who opposed him found themselves defeated or forced into uneasy truces. The more Nimrod heard, the more the pattern became clear. This was not mere fortune. It was as though the very God Abram served walked ahead of him. For a man like Nimrod, this was more than an affront. It was a challenge to his claim over the earth. His empire was built on the idea that human power could rise to the heavens, that the gods could be swayed by strength and sacrifice. Yet here was a man who offered neither to Nimrod's gods, yet seemed to possess protection greater than any army. Tensions between their spheres of influence grew. Skirmishes flared at the edges of Nimrod's territory. Traders loyal to the king were turned away from Abram's camps. Rumors spread among the people that Nimrod's power was waning, that his gods could not contend with the God of Abram. Within the palace walls, the king's temper hardened. He began to speak openly of confronting this God directly, of proving to his people that no divine force could overturn his will. To the priests, it was blasphemy. To the generals, it was a declaration of war beyond human reckoning. Yet none dared oppose him. Messengers were dispatched once more, this time bearing a proclamation. The king would display the might of the gods of Mesopotamia in a contest for all to witness. He would challenge the God of Abram to defend his servant. The details were left deliberately vague, but the intent was clear. This would be a public reckoning, a demonstration meant to humiliate Abram's God and restore the unshakable image of Nimrod's supremacy. As the appointed day drew near, the streets of Nineveh swelled with onlookers. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims filled the city, eager to witness what was promised as a spectacle unlike any other. The priests prepared their rites. The altars were stacked with offerings, and the royal guards lined the procession routes. In the heart of the city, a vast square had been cleared. At its center stood a towering pyre. It was stacked high, its base soaked with oil. The heat of the summer sun made the air shimmer, but it was nothing compared to the flames that would soon rise. It was here, before the eyes of his people, that Nimrod intended to demonstrate his power, and it was here that Abram's fate would be decided. The king emerged from his palace in ceremonial armor, his crown gleaming, his face set in grim resolve. Around him, the crowd roared in approval, but above the noise, there was an unease that even the most loyal subjects could not ignore. This was no battle between men. What was about to unfold would test not only the power of a king, but the limits of human defiance. The torches were brought forward. The pyre crackled as the first flames caught. The heat pressed outward, driving the crowd back. In the growing roar of the fire, Nimrod raised his hand to signal the beginning of the contest that would either cement his rule or bring to the brink of collapse. The flames surged higher, twisting in the wind. Their heat turned the air into a shimmering wall between crowd and the towering pyre. Smoke coiled upward, black against the glaring sun, and the scent of burning oil and timber swept through the square. Nimrod stood at the edge, his eyes fixed on Abram, who had been brought forward under heavy guard. Chains bound the prophet's hands, but there was no fear in his face, only a calm that unsettled those who looked upon him. The king's voice rang out over the roar of the fire. He proclaimed to the gathered throngs that this was a judgment of the gods of Mesopotamia against the defiance of one who refused their worship. He declared that Abram's God, if real, could save him from the fate prepared for him. The crowd murmured, some in agreement, others in doubt, but all eyes were fixed on the two men. The guard seized Abram and led him toward the pyre. The heat was suffocating, the wood hissing as sap boiled within. Priests chanted invocations to the gods, their words rising and falling in a rhythm meant to stir the divine to action. Nimrod watched closely, expecting to see fear break through Abram's composure, but the prophet's gaze remained steady, lifted toward the sky rather than the flames. What happened next would be spoken of for generations. As the heat became unbearable and the crowd shielded their faces, Abram stepped toward the fire, and yet the flames did not consume him. The wind shifted suddenly, driving the smoke back upon the priests and soldiers. Witnesses would later swear that the blaze parted around him, leaving him untouched, though the oil-soaked would burn furiously. The chants faltered. The square fell into stunned silence. Nimrod's face hardened. To admit defeat was unthinkable, but the scene before him left no other explanation in the minds of the people. This was not a trick, not an illusion. It was a deliverance beyond human power. The king turned sharply, ordering proceedings to end. The pyre burned down to embers, but Abram walked away unharmed, his chains falling from his wrists as if they had been no more than threads. Word of the event spread swiftly, carried by merchants and travelers to every corner of the land. In marketplaces and temple courtyards, the story was told and retold, that the God of Abram had triumphed over the gods of Nimrod, that no fire could touch his servant. For many, it was a sign that the creator of heaven and earth still ruled over kings, no matter their might. In the palace, Nimrod raged in private. He had built his empire on the image of invincibility. Yet before the eyes of his people, he had been defied, not by an army, but by one man and his God. His advisors urged caution, warning that any further attack on Abram would only magnify his legend. The king withdrew from direct confrontation, but his pride would not allow him to forget. Years passed, and Nimrod's power began to wane. The unity he had once commanded was long gone, replaced by rival kingdoms rising in the lands he had once ruled. The cities he had built remained, their walls and temples enduring, but their loyalty shifted. His name was still spoken with awe, but also with the memory of the day when even his might had been humbled. Abram continued his journey, guided by the promises of the God who had delivered him. His descendants would grow into a people who carried the knowledge of the Creator across generations, shaping the faiths and histories of nations. Nimrod's legacy, though formidable, was shadowed by the knowledge that his greatest work, the tower, had fallen, and his greatest challenge had ended in defeat. In the final years of his reign, Nimrod walked the halls of his palaces, past carvings of hunts and battles, past reliefs showing the tower that had once risen toward the heavens. The stones told of victories and conquests, Yet none could erase the moment when the fire had failed to burn a man who trusted in a higher power. For all his might, he had learned that there were limits no king could cross. And so the story of Nimrod, the mighty hunter, the builder of cities, the unifier of peoples, the challenger god, came to its close. His empire dissolved into the shifting sands of history, his monuments weathered by time. But the tale endured, a warning carved not in stone, but in memory. That human pride, no matter how great, will always meet its measure. The plains of Shinar lay quiet again, the wind sweeping across the land where the tower had once stood. Travelers still spoke of the ruins, of the scattering of tongues, of the king who had sought to reach the heavens, and the prophet who had walked through fire. And somewhere, beneath the endless sky, the truth remained, unchanged, unshaken, that the kingdoms of men rise and fall, but the word of the Creator stands forever.